Hey guys, this actually turns out to be one of my most favorite topics to talk about, and that is how do you make a diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinoma when the tumor is poorly differentiated and you have to resort to immunohistochemistry? Which markers work, which markers do not work, and this is largely going to be based on my experience with hepatocellular carcinoma. And of course, I'm going to depend significantly on literature as well. So let's get this underway. So IHC is helpful in two circumstances. One, when you have a biopsy from a mass lesion in the liver, and obviously, given that HCC is the most common primary malignancy in the liver, and HCC, regardless of what your clinician tells you, is going to be pretty high on the differential diagnosis. The second situation where you'll be thinking of a hepatocellular carcinoma, and this applies both to hepatic lesions and non-hepatic lesions, is when you look down the microscope and the cells look like a hepatocellular carcinoma. So what is so characteristic about hepatocellular carcinoma under the microscope? Now, I'm not going to go into great details. There's another talk that will do this. But one of the patterns that aids in the diagnosis of HCC is this macrotrabecular pattern. But remember, a trabecular pattern is often hepatocellular carcinoma, but there are other tumor types that also would create a macrotrabecular pattern. So watch for that. So there is no question that these cells look like hepatocytes. In fact, this is a hepatocellular carcinoma with a very solid appearance. Let's articulate for a second why these cells look like hepatocytes. Hepatocytes have a fairly characteristic appearance, right? Fairly abundant cytoplasm, often eosinophilic, distinct cytoplasmic membranes, round nuclei. You do often see some pleomorphism and big prominent nucleoli. But I can tell you from long experience that not everything that looks like a hepatocyte ends up being hepatocellular carcinoma, and often we'll use the word hepatoid to describe that phenomenon where the cells look hepatoid, but it isn't quite a hepatocellular carcinoma. All right, so question for you. Say this was in the lung. These cells certainly look like hepatocytes, right? They have that abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm. But are you absolutely certain that this is a hepatocellular carcinoma? And your answer is probably going to be, I think so, but I'm not absolutely sure. And that's where immunohistochemistry comes in. Now I'm going to tell you what immunohistochemistry works for me and what has not worked for me over the last decade or so in practice. All right, so let's start with CEA, specifically polyclonal CEA. Monoclonal CEA will not work. And what you're looking for in a hepatocellular carcinoma is this canalicular pattern of staining like here. In fact, this often looks like an Antlerhans. So for example, if you're not familiar with Antlerhans, here's what Antlerhans look like. So this is pretty classic for a hepatocellular carcinoma. There's no other tumor type that will create an Antlerhans-like configuration. So how good is a polyclonal CEA stain? Let's look at this slide. Now, is this canalicular pattern of staining? I frequently can't tell whether it's canalicular or it's cytoplasmic membrane pattern of staining. And therein lies the subjectivity. But that is not all. The other problem with the stain is that it seldom works when you need it the most. The time when you need it, the situation that you need a stain, is at the poorly differentiated end of the spectrum, and often you will not see a canalicular pattern in a poorly differentiated HCC. So to me, this is not a very useful stain. If this isn't useful, what next? All right, so next on the agenda is the good old alpha-fetoprotein. Here's a HCC that is diffusely and strongly positive for alpha-fetoprotein. How good is it as a stain for hepatocellular carcinoma? Again, unfortunately, like polyclonal CEA, it works when you don't need it at the well-differentiated end of the spectrum, but at the poorly differentiated end of the spectrum, it does not really work. So try it. It's worth trying. If it works, it's great, but if it's negative, it's not very helpful. And in most situations, in my experience, it is not very helpful. All right, so here's a very poorly differentiated carcinoma. It has a moderate amount of eosinophilic cytoplasm. It is possible that this is an HCC, but I couldn't be sure. I need some help. I need immunohistochemistry. Oh, and look, the HepPar1 is diffusely and strongly positive, and this is very typical for HepPar1. You see this sort of granular pattern of cytoplasmic reactivity. Oh, this has got to be a hepatocellular carcinoma, isn't it? Well, I can tell you this is not my favorite antibody. In fact, it turns out to be my least favorite antibody for a diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinoma. And since you asked so nicely, why is it my least favorite? Here you go. HepPar1 is positive in a substantial number of non-hepatic malignancies, particularly primary adenocarcinomas arising from the upper gastrointestinal tract 1. 2, like those other two markers, alpha-fetoprotein and polyclonal CEA we talked about, HepPar1 is often negative at the poorly differentiated end of the spectrum. So it does not work when you need it the most. And finally, remember, cholangiocarcinomas are positive. Now, a couple of hepatocellular markers also stain cholangiocarcinomas, and we'll talk about that when we talk about cholangiocarcinomas. So if I dislike them all, what do I like? What do I use? The go-to stain, according to me, for a diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinoma is Arginase 1. So take all those antibodies if you want, drop them into the drain. It's going to make no difference whatsoever. It is Arginase that you want. And what you look for with an Arginase stain is nuclear and cytoplasmic reactivity. So it seems to be both. And at least in our hands, it tends to be more than 95% specific for HCC and more than 95% sensitive for HCC. So if I'm counting on an antibody and I'm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and I have just one antibody that I can use, it'll be, you guessed it right, Arginase 1. So let's look at this case. In the center is a bundle of skeletal muscle, so we're clearly not in the liver. And on the right is tumor. Here's what the tumor looked like. They certainly look like hepatocytes. Perhaps they're making some sort of a trabecular architecture. I'm thinking hepatocellular carcinoma, but had no prior history of a hepatocellular carcinomas, and so I had to do something to prove that this was indeed a hepatocellular carcinoma. If I didn't, I'd have a very unhappy clinician. So as is often the case, I did not do an alpha-fetoprotein. I did not do a polyclonal CEA. I went right for the money, and the money here is Arginase. And fortunately, it was positive. Now, does this make me feel warm and fuzzy? I'd like to see some more reactivity, but this is sufficient. In our hands, Arginase is a pretty clean stain. This, to me, is definitely positive. That, to me, is sufficient evidence to call this hepatocellular carcinoma. But I can do more. And the more I often do is a chromogenic in situ hybridization stain for albumin. You can see strong reactivity across virtually every cell here. Here's a slightly higher power, and again, virtually every cell here stains strongly and diffusely positive for albumin. In our hands, albumin turns out to be the most sensitive marker of hepatocellular differentiation. Now, of course, albumin also stains cholangiocarcinomas, but as pathologists, in most cases, but not all, we can tell the difference between a hepatocellular carcinoma and a cholangiocarcinoma, and hence, in our hands, as well-trained pathologists, this is not only a sensitive marker, but this is also a specific marker of hepatocellular differentiation. Case in point, you remember this guy? These cells look like hepatocytes, but are you absolutely certain that this is HCC? Are you willing to stake your retirement fund on this? That's the question I would ask you. And I will not stake my retirement fund unless I get some immunohistochemistry done. And so, like I often do, I tried Arginase. Dead negative. And that is when I bring out my big guns. And my big gun here is KISH for albumin. This tumor was diffusely and strongly positive for albumin. And like I said before, this is the best stain you have for hepatocellular carcinomas. Arginase is pretty good, pretty damn good. But if you want that edge, you want to look a little better than your fellow pathologist, use albumin. All right, so there's one marker that I haven't talked about, and that is Glypican-3. And what you're looking for with Glypican-3 is this membranous pattern of reactivity, although in our hands the reactivity is often diffuse. Now Glypican-3 is somewhat unique because it double dips. And what do I mean by that? Glypican-3 can not only tell you that it is liver, but it can also distinguish between benign and malignant liver. Remember, none of the other stains can distinguish between a hepatic adenoma and a hepatocellular carcinoma. Glypican-3 can do that, although like many of the other stains, the sensitivity tends to drop off at the poorly differentiated end of the spectrum. All right, so a very quick review of the markers, and you probably noticed that I do not go into a lot of theory. I'm going to just touch upon the most practical aspects of what you need to know to make a diagnosis. For more theoretical knowledge, I figured that there's a number of excellent reviews out there, and as well as a number of excellent textbooks out there. So very quickly, a couple of highlights here. One is many of these markers are part of either the urea cycle, obviously the liver has a big role to play in the urea cycle, or, as you'll see, are oncofetoproteins. None of them, in fact, I would venture to say that none of them are 100% specific, but your best markers out there are Arginase, and not on this table, albumin. So your go-to markers really should be Arginase, and if you can afford it and your lab has it, albumin. And I want to end this talk by telling you that in spite of all of this immunohistochemistry, I'm still very old school. I still believe that an immunohistochemical stain is an ancillary test. Remember, to me, the H&E is king. So my ultimate diagnosis is largely based on the H&E. I will never ever make a diagnosis purely on an immunohistochemical stain because there is no stain right now or will ever be 100% specific and 100% sensitive. H&E is still king. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.